If life were fair, the boy who studied the hardest would always win. That was the belief Adrian Cole carried through every sleepless night of his youth. Growing up above his mother's small neighborhood grocery store in Cedar Falls, Iowa, Adrian learned early that nothing in life came easily. The store's flickering fluorescent lights often stayed on long after midnight, and while his mother counted receipts behind the counter, Adrian sat at a narrow kitchen table with textbooks stacked in uneven towers around him. While other teenagers slept, Adrian memorized formulas, solved equations, and reread chapters until the words blurred together. Success, to him, was never talent. It was survival. Every scholarship application, every exam score, every academic competition was another step away from the fragile life he and his mother struggled to maintain. But no matter how hard Adrian pushed himself, no matter how perfect his grades were, there was always one name above his on every list. Sebastian Whitmore. Even the teachers spoke his name with a kind of quiet admiration. Sebastian was the golden son of one of the most powerful families in the state. His father owned half the real estate along the riverfront and shared the board of multiple companies, and Sebastian carried himself with the calm confidence of someone who had never once worried about whether the electricity bill would be paid on time. Tall, composed, and effortlessly brilliant, Sebastian didn't appear to study half as hard as Adrian did, yet he still walked away with every first-place medal, every scholarship, every title that Adrian had fought so desperately to earn. Their rivalry began in middle school when they both competed in the regional science fair. Adrian had spent 3 months building his project out of recycled parts and borrowed tools. Sebastian arrived with a sleek presentation that looked like something out of a professional laboratory. Adrian still remembered standing in the crowded auditorium when the judges announced the winner. First place, Sebastian Whitmore. Second place, Adrian Cole. That pattern never changed. Debate tournaments, academic decathlons, statewide exams. Every single time Adrian believed he might finally outrun the shadow hanging over him, Sebastian was already there at the finish line. At first Adrian told himself he hated Sebastian because of what he represented: wealth, privilege, the unfair head start Adrian never had. But the truth was more complicated than that. Because no matter how much he tried to ignore him, Adrian always noticed Sebastian. The quiet way he observed everything in the room. The sharp intelligence behind his gray eyes. The calm voice he used when answering questions that left everyone else silent. Sebastian Whitmore wasn't just an obstacle in Adrian's life. He was the one person Adrian could never quite stop thinking about. Years passed, and the two of them carried their rivalry into college, where the competition only intensified. Professors often joke that if Adrian and Sebastian were in the same class, everyone else was competing for third place. Adrian hated those jokes. Yet somewhere beneath the irritation and pride, there was an unspoken understanding between them, a tension neither of them could fully explain. And then came the night that would change everything. A class reunion held at a downtown hotel. Laughter, music, old classmates sharing stories about where life had taken them. Adrian had only planned to stay for an hour. But fate had other plans for both of them, because before that night ended, the rivalry that had defined their entire lives was about to turn into something neither of them had ever expected. The reunion was held in a tall glass hotel overlooking the river that cut through the center of the city, the kind of place Adrian Cole had only seen from the outside during his college years. Soft golden lights filled the ballroom, and the sound of music and conversation drifted through the air like a warm current. Former classmates gathered in small circles, laughing about old professors and retelling stories that had grown larger with time. Adrian stood near the refreshment table with a paper cup of sparkling water in his hand, feeling slightly out of place in his simple charcoal suit. He had spent the last few years building a stable career as a graduate researcher, but events like this always reminded him how different his life had been from many of the people in the room. Across the ballroom, he noticed the familiar figure almost immediately. Sebastian Whitmore stood near the tall windows that overlooked the river, speaking with a small group of alumni. He looked exactly as Adrian remembered, composed and confident, dressed in a tailored navy suit that probably cost more than Adrian's entire monthly rent. Even from across the room, Sebastian carried the same quiet authority that had always set him apart. When Sebastian laughed at something someone said, several people turned toward him instinctively, drawn by his presence the way people were drawn to bright lights in a dark room. Adrian looked away quickly, telling himself he did not care. He had spent years trying to build a life that did not revolve around the shadow of Sebastian Whitmore. Tonight was just a reunion, nothing more. But the moment he lifted the cup to take another sip, a strange warmth spread through his chest. At first he thought the ballroom had simply become crowded, but within seconds the warmth deepened into a wave of heat that rolled through his body. His pulse quickened. The room suddenly felt smaller, the lights brighter, the sounds of conversation louder than before. Adrian set the cup down on the nearest table and stepped toward the hallway, trying to steady his breathing. He had never experienced anything like this before. The air felt thick and heavy, and a faint dizziness clouded his thoughts. As he reached the quieter corridor outside the ballroom, the sensation intensified. His hands trembled slightly as he leaned against the cool marble wall, trying to make sense of what was happening. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he remembered a lecture from a biology seminar years ago, a brief discussion about the rare possibility of late omega presentation in adults. Adrian had dismissed the topic back then. It had never seemed relevant to his life. But now the realization struck him like a sudden flash of lightning. The overwhelming warmth, the racing heartbeat, the strange pull in his instincts. This was a heat cycle beginning for the very first time. Panic surged through him. Adrian fumbled for his phone with unsteady fingers and scrolled through his contacts, searching for the one friend he trusted enough to ask for help without explanation. The hallway lights blurred slightly as he typed a short message asking them to come to the hotel room he had booked upstairs for the night. His thoughts were scattered and unfocused, but he pressed send anyway, hoping help would arrive quickly. What Adrian did not realize in his confusion was that the message had gone to the wrong contact entirely. Instead of reaching the friend he had intended, the request for help appeared on the phone of the one person in the building he would never have chosen. Across the ballroom floor, Sebastian Whitmore felt his phone vibrate in his pocket and glanced down at the unexpected message from Adrian Cole. For a moment, Sebastian Whitmore simply stared at the message on his screen, wondering if he had read it correctly. Adrian Cole had never once asked him for anything. In every memory Sebastian had of their years of rivalry, Adrian had always stood stubbornly on his own, determined to prove that he did not need help from anyone, especially not from Sebastian. Yet the message was unmistakably real. It was short, hurried, and strangely vulnerable, asking someone to come to the hotel room upstairs as quickly as possible. Sebastian read the words again, noticing the subtle tension hidden between the lines. Something was wrong. Without announcing where he was going, Sebastian stepped away from the group of alumni near the window and walked toward the elevator lobby. The polished marble floor reflected the warm ceiling lights as he pressed the button for the upper floors. He told himself he was only going to confirm whether Adrian had meant to contact him or someone else. Still, a faint sense of unease lingered in the back of his mind as the elevator doors closed and began their quiet ascent. When the doors opened several floors above the ballroom, the hallway was silent except for the distant hum of air conditioning. Sebastian followed the room number from the message until he reached the correct door. For a moment he hesitated before knocking, unsure what kind of situation he was about to step into. The door opened only a few inches before Adrian appeared in the narrow gap. His normally calm expression looked strained and unsettled, and there was a faint flush across his cheeks that Sebastian had never seen before. Adrian froze the moment he realized who stood outside the door. Surprise flickered across his face, followed by confusion. Sebastian spoke first, his voice steady but cautious as he held up his phone. "You sent a message asking for help." Adrian stared at the screen, and then at Sebastian again as the realization slowly dawned on him. The message had gone to the wrong person. A quiet wave of embarrassment crossed his expression, but it was quickly replaced by the same uneasy tension that had filled the hallway moments earlier. Adrian stepped back slightly as though trying to steady himself, one hand resting against the edge of the desk inside the room. The air inside carried a faint warmth that felt different from the cool hallway outside. Sebastian noticed immediately that Adrian seemed disoriented, as if struggling to remain focused. "What is going on?" Sebastian asked quietly. Adrian shook his head, trying to collect his thoughts. "I think something is wrong with me," he admitted after a moment, his voice quieter than usual. "I suddenly started feeling overheated and dizzy during the reunion downstairs. I did not know what to do." Sebastian stepped inside the room and closed the door behind him, instinctively attentive now that he could see Adrian more clearly. The tension in Adrian's posture and the unsettled rhythm of his breathing suggested something deeper than simple exhaustion. Sebastian had grown up surrounded by pack dynamics and biological discussions that most people never thought about. As he watched Adrian struggle to steady himself, a quiet understanding formed in his mind. "Adrian," Sebastian said carefully, You may be experiencing your first Omega heat. The words seemed to freeze the room for a brief second. Adrian's eyes widened slightly as the possibility settled over him. Neither of them had ever imagined their lives would intersect in this way, yet the situation unfolding between them now felt impossible to ignore. Outside the tall windows, the city lights shimmered across the river, while inside the quiet hotel room the tension between two lifelong rivals shifted into something unfamiliar and deeply complicated. The realization settled over the room like a quiet storm that neither of them had expected to face together. Adrian stood near the desk, gripping the edge as though it were the only thing keeping him steady. The warmth running through his body had grown stronger, spreading through his chest and arms in waves that made it difficult to concentrate. For most of his life, Adrian had believed he was simply another beta, someone who existed outside the complicated instincts that defined many alpha and omega dynamics. Discovering the truth now, in a quiet hotel room with the one person who had shaped so much of his past, felt almost unreal. Sebastian watched him carefully, keeping his voice calm and controlled. "You need to slow your breathing," he said gently. "Your body is reacting to something new, but it does not mean you are in danger." Adrian tried to follow the advice, inhaling slowly as he leaned back against the desk. Even so, the room seemed warmer with every passing minute. The faint scent of clean linen and hotel soap mixed with something unfamiliar in the air, something that made his thoughts blur together in ways he could not easily explain. Adrian closed his eyes for a moment, trying to steady the rushing feeling in his chest. "This cannot be happening," he murmured quietly. "I have never experienced anything like this before." Sebastian understood more about the situation than Adrian realized. Growing up in a powerful alpha family meant he had been taught from a young age how omega biology worked, and how dangerous a first heat could be without support. Yet even with that knowledge, he had never imagined standing here with Adrian Cole, the one rival who had challenged him at every stage of life. The tension between them felt different now, no longer defined by competition or pride. It was something quieter and far more complicated. Sebastian stepped closer, careful not to move too quickly. The instinctive awareness between them had grown stronger since he entered the room, as though some invisible thread had formed connecting them in a way neither of them fully understood. Adrian opened his eyes again when he sensed Sebastian nearby. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, years of rivalry and unspoken tension hanging silently between them. "I did not mean to call you," Adrian admitted after a moment, his voice softer than usual. "I thought I was sending that message to someone else." Sebastian nodded once, accepting the explanation without judgment. "I understand," he replied calmly. "But I am here now, and we should focus on helping you through this." Adrian wanted to argue, to insist that he could handle the situation alone like he had handled everything else in his life. Yet the steady warmth flowing through him made it difficult to deny that he needed help. His thoughts felt slower, less organized than usual, and the quiet presence of Sebastian nearby seemed to ground him in ways he had not expected. Outside the hotel windows, the lights of the city reflected across the dark surface of the river, shimmering like distant stars. Inside the room, the silence grew deeper as both of them realized that whatever happened next would change the course of their lives in ways neither of them could fully predict. The night stretched quietly around them as the city lights shimmered beyond the tall glass windows, and for several long moments neither Adrian nor Sebastian spoke. Adrian's thoughts felt scattered and heavy, like pages of a book blown out of order by the wind. The unfamiliar heat running through his body had softened slightly, but had not disappeared, leaving behind a strange sense of vulnerability that Adrian hated feeling. He had spent his entire life proving he could stand on his own without relying on anyone, and yet here he was, leaning on the quiet presence of the one person he had competed against for years. Sebastian remained calm, moving carefully around the room to pour a glass of cold water from the small hotel pitcher before handing it to Adrian. "Drink slowly," he said, his voice steady and reassuring. Adrian accepted the glass and took a few careful sips, the cool water helping clear the fog clouding his thoughts. For a moment the tension between them eased into something almost peaceful. They spoke quietly about what Adrian was experiencing and what the next few hours might bring, and Sebastian stayed nearby, offering the kind of quiet support Adrian had never imagined accepting from him. The night passed in a blur of uncertainty and unfamiliar emotions, and by the time the first pale light of morning crept over the horizon, Adrian felt exhausted both physically and mentally. When Adrian woke later that morning, The room was silent except for the distant sound of traffic far below the hotel. The warmth that had overwhelmed him the night before had faded into a dull, lingering memory, leaving behind a heavy realization that something important had changed between them. Sebastian stood near the window looking out at the river, his posture calm but thoughtful. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Adrian's mind raced with questions about what had happened and what it meant for the future. The complicated history between them suddenly felt heavier than ever before. Fear crept quietly into Adrian's chest. The idea of being tied to Sebastian Whitmore in any lasting way felt overwhelming. Sebastian belonged to a world of influence, power, and expectations that Adrian had spent his whole life trying to avoid. Panic began to replace the fragile calm of the morning. Before Sebastian could say much more, Adrian made a decision that surprised even himself. He gathered his belongings quickly, offering only a brief explanation that he needed time to think. Sebastian watched him carefully but did not try to stop him, perhaps sensing that Adrian would not listen if he tried. Within an hour, Adrian had left the hotel, disappearing from the city with little more than a suitcase and a mind full of unanswered questions. Weeks passed as Adrian moved quietly to a small riverside town several states away, a peaceful place where no one knew his past. There he accepted a position as a school teacher, building a quiet routine among tree-lined streets and friendly neighbors. Life slowly settled into something gentle and predictable. Then one autumn morning, nearly 2 months after leaving the city, Adrian stood in the small bathroom of his rented house, staring at a test in his hands, while the realization slowly spread through his chest. The faint lines were impossible to misunderstand. Adrian Cole was going to have a child. The news did not arrive with celebration or music. It arrived quietly in the early morning light of a small riverside town where Adrian Cole had begun building a life no one from his past could easily find. The narrow bathroom of his rented house smelled faintly of soap and fresh paint as Adrian stood in front of the mirror, the small white test resting in his hand. For a long time he did not move. The faint lines were clear and unmistakable. He was going to have a child. The realization moved slowly through his thoughts like the calm current of the river that flowed just beyond the town. Adrian lowered himself onto the edge of the bathtub, trying to steady the rush of emotions rising inside him. Fear came first, sharp and immediate. He was alone in a town where he had arrived only weeks earlier. He had no family nearby, no friends who knew the truth about his past, and no plan for how to face the months ahead. Yet beneath the fear there was something softer, something warm that he had never expected to feel. The idea that a new life was beginning quietly inside him filled the small room with a fragile sense of hope. Adrian rested a hand against his chest as he exhaled slowly. For most of his life, he had fought for survival, for education, for every opportunity that had brought him this far. Perhaps this child was not a burden, but a new reason to keep moving forward. The months that followed were not easy, but they were filled with determination. Adrian continued teaching at the small elementary school near the center of town, guiding young students through reading lessons and science projects, while quietly preparing for the arrival of the child who would soon change his world. The town itself was gentle and welcoming, the kind of place where neighbors waved from front porches and children rode bicycles down quiet streets beneath rows of maple trees. Adrian found comfort in the routine of his days. In the morning, he walked along the river before school began, watching the sunlight reflect across the calm water. In the afternoon, he graded papers at the kitchen table while the warm breeze drifted through the open windows of his small house. As the seasons shifted and the leaves turned gold and red, Adrian's life slowly adjusted to the future waiting ahead. When the child was finally born, the winter snow had already covered the town in a quiet blanket of white. Adrian named the boy Lucas. From the very first moment Adrian held him, wrapped in a soft hospital blanket, he understood that everything in his life had changed forever. Lucas grew quickly, filling Adrian's days with laughter, questions, and the kind of simple joy that only a child could bring. 3 years passed in this peaceful rhythm. Adrian built a life centered around morning breakfasts, school lessons, bedtime stories, and walks along the riverbank with Lucas holding his hand. The past felt far away now, like a story from another life. But somewhere hundreds of miles away, Sebastian Whitmore had never forgotten the night that connected them, and the quiet bond between them had never truly faded. 3 years passed in the quiet rhythm of Adrian Cole's new life, and the small riverside town slowly became the only world his son had ever known. Lucas grew into a curious and energetic child with dark hair that always seemed slightly messy no matter how carefully Adrian tried to comb it each morning. Their days followed a simple pattern that Adrian had come to treasure. Every morning began with the smell of toast and warm pancakes drifting through the kitchen of their small white house. Lucas would sit at the table swinging his legs while Adrian packed a lunchbox for school, listening patiently as his son told long and imaginative stories about dinosaurs, astronauts, and river monsters that might live beneath the old wooden bridge near town. After breakfast, Adrian walked Lucas to the small preschool building a few blocks away, before continuing on to the elementary school, where he taught fourth-grade science. The town was peaceful in a way Adrian had never experienced during his competitive years in the city. Neighbors waved from their front porches, children rode bicycles along quiet sidewalks, and the slow river reflected the sky like a sheet of glass each afternoon. For Adrian, it felt like the life he had never believed he could have. Yet far away in the city where towering buildings overlooked crowded streets, Sebastian Whitmore had spent those same 3 years living with a quiet absence he could never fully explain. From the outside, his life appeared unchanged. He had taken on greater responsibilities within his family's company and attended meetings in offices overlooking the skyline. Business partners respected his calm intelligence and steady leadership, and newspapers occasionally mentioned the Whitmore name in articles about expanding investments and corporate growth. But none of those accomplishments filled the strange emptiness that had remained with him since the night Adrian disappeared. The bond that had formed between them had never faded. At times, Sebastian would pause in the middle of a long meeting and feel the faint echo of Adrian's presence somewhere beyond his reach, like a distant signal carried by the wind. For months, he tried to convince himself that Adrian had simply chosen a different path and that it was better to leave the past alone. Yet the unanswered questions never stopped returning. Eventually, Sebastian began searching quietly, using resources that few people outside his world could access. Private investigators traced records across several states, following small clues that might lead to Adrian's new life. The process took time, and more than once the trail seemed to disappear entirely. But Sebastian Whitmore had never been someone who gave up easily. One autumn afternoon, nearly 3 years after the reunion, a simple report arrived at his office. It described a small town beside a winding river and a school teacher named Adrian Cole who had moved there shortly after leaving the city. Sebastian read the report. Slowly, his expression calm even as a powerful realization settled into his chest. Adrian had not just disappeared. He had built an entirely new life far away from everything they once shared. Within hours, Sebastian arranged a quiet trip out of the city. When his car finally turned onto the narrow road leading into the peaceful riverside town, he had no idea that the greatest surprise of all was still waiting for him there. The town appeared exactly as the report had described, quiet and surrounded by wide stretches of green fields and tall trees that bent gently in the autumn breeze. Sebastian Whitmore parked his car near the center of town and stepped out onto a narrow sidewalk lined with small local shops. The air smelled faintly of fresh bread from a nearby bakery and the distant river that flowed just beyond the row of houses. It was a peaceful place, far removed from the tall buildings and constant noise of the city he had left behind that morning. For several minutes, Sebastian simply walked along the street, observing the calm rhythm of the town. Parents pushed strollers along the sidewalks, elderly couples sat on wooden benches beneath maple trees, and children chased each other across the grass in a nearby park. It was difficult to imagine Adrian choosing a life so different from the competitive world they had once shared, yet somehow the quiet surroundings felt strangely fitting. Adrian had always valued determination and simplicity more than prestige or wealth. Following the directions in the report, Sebastian eventually reached the small elementary school near the river. The building was modest but welcoming, with colorful drawings taped to the classroom windows and a playground filled with laughter from children finishing their afternoon activities. Sebastian paused near the wooden fence surrounding the playground, watching quietly as teachers guided their students toward waiting parents. Then he saw him. Adrian stood near the school entrance speaking with a group of children, his expression calm and warm in a way Sebastian had never seen during their years of rivalry. The competitive tension that had once defined Adrian seemed to have softened into something more patient and thoughtful. For a moment, Sebastian simply watched from a distance, absorbing the sight of the life Adrian had built here. As the final students began leaving the playground, one small boy ran toward Adrian with quick, excited steps. The child could not have been older than 3 or 4 years old. His dark hair moved wildly as he ran, and his bright eyes carried a familiar shade that made Sebastian pause where he stood. The boy wrapped his arms around Adrian's legs and began speaking rapidly about something that had happened during the day. Adrian laughed softly and lifted the child into his arms with an ease that suggested this was a daily routine. Sebastian felt a quiet shift in his chest as he observed the moment. Something about the child's features stirred a strange sense of recognition. The curve of the boy's smile, the shade of his eyes, even the confident way he looked around the playground carried an echo that Sebastian could not ignore. Adrian turned slightly while adjusting the child in his arms, and for the first time his gaze lifted toward the fence where Sebastian stood. The moment their eyes met, time seemed to pause between them. Surprise flickered across Adrian's face, followed by a wave of emotions he could not immediately hide. Sebastian remained still, the quiet truth settling slowly into place as he looked from Adrian to the small boy resting comfortably in his arms. The child who looked so much like him. For several long seconds neither Adrian nor Sebastian moved. The sounds of children laughing and parents chatting around the playground faded into the background as the weight of 3 years of unanswered questions stood silently between them. Adrian's heart began to beat faster as he adjusted the small boy in his arms. Lucas noticed the sudden change in his father's posture and turned his head curiously toward the tall stranger standing near the fence. Sebastian Whitmore had faced complex negotiations and high-level business decisions throughout his life. Yet in that moment, none of those experiences prepared him for the quiet realization settling inside his chest. The child in Adrian's arms was not just any child. The resemblance was too clear to ignore. The boy's eyes reflected the same shade of gray that had stared back at Sebastian from mirrors his entire life. Adrian finally broke the silence by walking slowly toward the fence, each step careful as though the ground beneath him might shift. When he reached Sebastian, the two men stood only a few feet apart for the first time in 3 years. Lucas studied Sebastian with open curiosity before waving his small hand in a friendly greeting. Adrian's voice was calm, but carried a trace of tension when he spoke. "This is Lucas." Sebastian looked at the boy again, and something warm and unfamiliar stirred quietly beneath the composure he had carried for so many years. "Hello, Lucas," he said gently. The boy smiled before turning back toward Adrian, already distracted by the colorful playground behind them. Adrian lowered Lucas to the ground and watched as the child ran off to climb the small wooden structure nearby. Only after Lucas was safely occupied did Adrian look back at Sebastian. The silence between them returned, but it felt different now. 3 years ago their lives had separated in confusion and uncertainty. Now the truth stood clearly between them. Sebastian spoke first, his voice steady but filled with quiet emotion. "I searched for you." Adrian lowered his gaze briefly before answering. "I know you would." Sebastian nodded slowly. "You should have told me." Adrian let out a soft breath as he looked toward Lucas playing in the distance. "I did not know how. Everything about my life was changing, and I was afraid that your world and mine would never fit together." Sebastian considered his words carefully before responding. "Maybe we both misunderstood what mattered most." Adrian looked back at him then, noticing something he had never seen before in Sebastian's expression. Not rivalry, not pride, but honesty. The truth was simple and impossible to deny any longer. For years they had believed their connection was built on competition and frustration. Yet standing there beside the quiet Rivertown playground, both of them understood that the rivalry had always hidden something deeper. Lucas ran back toward them a moment later and reached for Adrian's hand before glancing up at Sebastian again with bright curiosity. Adrian hesitated only briefly before speaking quietly. "If you want to know him, you can." Sebastian looked down at the small boy and then back at Adrian. For the first time since arriving in the town, a genuine smile touched his face. "Maybe this time we do not run from the truth. Maybe we finally learn how to build something together."